This year was my first Lunar New Year with my husband, James Song, since our marriage. When it came time to decide whose family we would spend the holiday with, we argued. Back when he was deeply in love with me, he had promised that all future Lunar New Years would be spent with my family, but it had only been 6 months since our wedding, and now he was going back on his word, talking about how much his parents had sacrificed for him. I raised my hand to stop him mid-sentence and pulled out my phone, searching for the phrase "my parents sacrificed so much for me" online. I found thousands of videos. Clicking on one, I held it up for him to watch. The video's creator passionately ranted, "Your parents sacrifice so much because you are useless and lazy. Your mom works hard because you don't help her in the kitchen. Your dad works the fields because you don't lend a hand. But now that you're married, suddenly you remember their sacrifices." Trying to suppress my laughter, I watched James's face turn green bit by bit. The internet's sharp tongue was far more effective than anything I could have said. Sighing, I knew the issue still needed to be resolved, so I proposed a compromise. "I have an idea. How about we invite both sets of parents to celebrate the new year with us? The 6 of us can spend it together." James's eyes lit up at my suggestion. It seemed he wasn't too eager to spend the holiday at his parents' house either. Their home in the countryside was drafty, with poor insulation. They didn't like to use coal for heating or electricity to save money, leaving the house so cold you could see your breath and had to stomp your feet to stay warm. I called my parents first. Initially, they refused, but when they heard that my in-laws would also be coming, they reluctantly agreed. On James's side, it wasn't smooth sailing either. His parents came up with various excuses to decline, but when James finally threatened that we wouldn't visit them at all if they didn't come, they gave in. My parents arrived first, bringing bags of New Year's supplies that nearly filled the refrigerator to capacity. James's parents arrived late in the evening, carrying 2 large sacks, one filled with vegetables like cabbage, carrots, and green beans, and the other with scallions. This posed a bit of a problem. The refrigerator was already full, and the room temperature was too high for the vegetables. We had no choice but to store them on the balcony. My mother, wearing an apron, came out of the kitchen to greet my in-laws. My mother-in-law's face darkened, and she muttered, "It seems like your mother treats this house like it's her own." Hearing the undertone, my mom chose to brush it off with a polite smile, not wanting to stir up trouble during the holiday. Dinner was prepared by my mom, who's an excellent cook. James had suggested ordering food from a restaurant to save her the effort, but my mom adamantly refused. "I genuinely enjoy cooking," she said. "Making food for my family brings me happiness. If you're worried about me getting tired, just lend a hand in the kitchen." James and I stayed in the kitchen to help, while his parents lounged in the living room watching TV. My dad, feeling awkward, retreated to the study to play chess on the computer. First, my mother-in-law came into the kitchen to look around, but after a quick glance, she didn't come back. Instead, she kept calling for James to help her. One moment she'd ask how to change the channel, the next she'd claim the remote batteries were dead, and then she'd complain that the room was too warm and needed a window opened. James ran back and forth, increasingly exasperated. My mom gestured for James to head back to the living room. "Let him run back and forth if it keeps him busy. Otherwise, I might as well do it myself," she said with a chuckle. She added softly, "I know it's awkward for 2 families who aren't familiar with each other to spend time together. Just let it slide for now. Once we get through the Lunar New Year, it'll all pass." By the time we set the table with all the dishes, we were ready to sit down and eat. But when we looked around, my mother-in-law was nowhere to be found. I searched the balcony, the bathroom, and finally found her in the kitchen. She was sitting on a small stool, holding a tiny bowl of rice with a small plate of pickled vegetables in front of her. "Mom, what are you doing? Everyone's waiting for you. Come join us at the table," James said hurriedly, stepping forward. "I'm fine here," she muttered weakly. "I don't deserve to sit at that table. I don't even recognize half the dishes you've made." "What kind of talk is that? Mom, stop making a fuss and come eat," James said, sweating nervously as he glanced back toward the dining room, where my parents were peeking in, clearly curious. He looked like he wanted to drag her out by force. "James, you don't get it," she continued, sighing dramatically. "This spread must have cost a fortune. How can you live like this? I'm just worried about you wasting money. I almost burst out laughing but managed to hold it in for the sake of not embarrassing my parents. If they weren't here, I would have given my mother-in-law a piece of my mind. But for now, I decided to help James defuse the situation. Mom, if you really don't want to eat, we won't force you, I said calmly. But you should know, my dad has already had 2 glasses of Moutai and is pouring himself a third. Her reaction was immediate. She shot up from the stool and hurried into the dining room. My father-in-law, who usually had to check her expression before even sipping alcohol, was gleefully pouring himself another full glass of the premium liquor my dad had brought. The sight of the Moutai had clearly been too much of a temptation. My mother-in-law stormed in and snatched the bottle from his hands. She froze for a moment, staring at the label. Oh my, this isn't just liquor. This is practically money in a bottle. Who drinks something like this? For fun, my dad joked, offering her a glass. Why don't you try a sip? Too. She quickly waved him off. I couldn't possibly drink this. Old man, take it easy. Don't overdo it and make a fool of yourself. Even as she scolded him, she handed the bottle back, motioning for him to keep pouring. He obediently filled his glass to the brim once more. Finally satisfied, she sat down at the table and began inspecting the dishes. My mom's cooking was meticulous, with every plate beautifully presented. For 6 people, she had prepared 12 dishes, ensuring there would be plenty to go around. Delicacies like sea cucumbers and abalone were portioned perfectly, 6 pieces of each, one for everyone. As everyone waited for her to start eating, the dishes remained untouched. My mother-in-law finally picked up her chopsticks and immediately went for the abalone. She served 2 pieces to her son, 2 to her husband, and 2 to herself. In the blink of an eye, the plate was left with only the decorative garnish of a few sprigs of greens. We all sat there in stunned silence, watching as my mother-in-law picked out the best pieces of food for herself. She was laughing as she started eating with gusto, as if completely oblivious to the awkwardness in the room. James looked so embarrassed he seemed ready to dig a hole in the floor with his foot. He didn't dare lift his head. The sea cucumbers she had claimed were already on her plate, so there was no retrieving them. James quickly took the 2 on his plate, giving one to my dad and the other to my mom. Eat them yourself, my mother-in-law snapped, tapping his hand with her chopsticks. It was at that moment that everything became crystal clear to me. This wasn't cluelessness. This was willful ignorance. I regretted ever suggesting we all spend the new year together, perhaps to prevent her from causing any more trouble. James stood up and divided all the remaining dishes into portions for each person. Only then did he sit back down with a sigh of relief. But before long, my mother-in-law picked up a piece of vegetable, took one bite, and put it back on the serving plate. Mom, if you're going to take it, just eat it yourself, James said hurriedly, moving the bitten vegetable to her own plate. Her eyes instantly welled with tears, and she slammed her bowl down on the table. I told you I didn't want to sit at the table. You insisted I join. And now I've embarrassed myself because I don't know proper table manners. She began sobbing loudly, her tears falling like raindrops. The room went silent as everyone froze, unsure of what to do. My mom gave me a pointed look. I rolled my eyes and lazily got up, heading to the kitchen to grab a towel. Returning to the table, I placed it over my mother-in-law's face, catching her off guard. She sneezed several times in rapid succession, each sneeze directed squarely at the table despite having the towel in her hands. With the food now rendered inedible, the meal was effectively over. My mom, using her gift for diplomacy, managed to calm my mother-in-law down, but no one had the appetite to continue eating. However, my mother-in-law seemed to recover her enthusiasm quickly, returning to the table to pick through the dishes for herself. James pulled me aside after the meal, his face full of guilt. Elena, tomorrow I'll send my parents back home. This isn't fair to you or your parents. I gave him a bitter smile. Let's send my mom home too. She must be exhausted. Only now did I truly understand why James kept his family at arm's length. He knew exactly what kind of people they were. Outside, fireworks were beginning to go off. James had bought 2 large boxes of fireworks because he knew I loved watching them. But after everything that had happened, my mood was completely ruined. It was no longer about enjoying them but merely going through the motions. As we carried the boxes outside, my mother-in-law's sharp eyes zeroed in on them. How much did these cost? These big ones must be at least $5 each. She grabbed one of the tubes, examining it closely. When she spotted the price tag, she shrieked, "What? This tiny thing costs $198." My dad chuckled, trying to smooth things over. "It's just for the holiday. The kids enjoy it." She muttered under her breath. "Who spoils their kids like this? What a waste of money. And who's even a kid anymore? She's nearly 30. Her voice wasn't quiet enough to escape anyone's notice. James finally couldn't hold back. "Mom, just go downstairs first," he said, ushering her out the door. I had already lost all excitement for the fireworks. Normally, I'd cheer and clap with every burst of light. But tonight I could only force a few half-hearted reactions, not wanting to dampen my parents' spirits. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law ignored everything, loudly exclaiming about the cost of the fireworks. "This is like burning money. Do you kids even have your mortgage paid off yet? Spending money like water. Huh, your dad and I never indulged ourselves. Not even once. We saved every penny for you too," my mother-in-law declared as she bundled herself tighter in the cold. My mom, sensing my growing irritation, quickly took her arm and led her upstairs. "It's chilly out. Let's head inside." As they walked, my mother-in-law caught sight of my mom's clothes and reached out to touch the soft fabric. "Oh, in-law, what kind of outfit is this? So smooth and well-fitted. How much did it cost?" "This?" My mom laughed lightly, somewhat embarrassed. "It was a birthday gift from my husband." "How much did it cost?" My mother-in-law pried, her curiosity refusing to let the topic drop. 3.800 yuan. My mom admitted reluctantly. "Goodness, I can't even touch that. If it gets ruined, I couldn't afford to replace it." My mother-in-law recoiled as if the outfit were electrified, pulling back her hand like she'd touched a live wire. She now acted as though my mom were a ticking time bomb. People nearby glanced over, curious about the commotion. My mom, her cheeks red with embarrassment, quickly clarified. "It's not like we buy things like this all the time. My husband and I are retired professors, so our pensions are quite good. I also write novels for extra income," she added, lowering her voice. "But even with that, we don't splurge much. Most of our money goes to support the kids. At our age, who would we dress up for?" That was the last straw for me. Striding up to them, I stepped between my mom and my mother-in-law. "Mom, where's my New Year's money?" Before my parents arrived, my mom had insisted on giving me a card loaded with 50.000 yuan as New Year's money, but I had firmly refused. James and I had decent incomes and didn't want to rely on our parents. But now, I intended to accept it, just to make a point. My mom hesitated for a moment but, seeing that I was serious, pulled the card from her pocket with a smile. "Here, James, there's 50.000 yuan on this card from your father and me. Saved up to help you two out." I deliberately called out in a loud voice. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad." James, beaming from ear to ear, turned to my parents and expressed his gratitude. Then I turned to my mother-in-law. "Mom, I heard you've been saving up, too, to help us. Did you prepare any New Year's money for us?" Her expression visibly faltered, and she stammered. We don't have much saved. Income is tight." I extended my hand. "That's fine, Mom. It's the thought that counts. Even a little means a lot." After all, when I'd bought gifts, clothes, and New Year's goods for both sets of parents, I had spent an equal amount, 5.000 yuan each. Yet my mother-in-law hadn't given a penny in return, and still had the audacity to make snide remarks. I'd had enough. Her face turned bright red, and she couldn't muster a coherent response. Flustered, she mumbled something about the cold and darted ahead of us to avoid further embarrassment. Not wanting my parents to witness too much of this unpleasantness, I bit back my anger, and we all made our way upstairs. Next came the room assignments. James and I had already decided beforehand. We had a 3-bedroom apartment, so his parents would take the master bedroom, my parents the guest room, and we'd sleep in the study. We had reclinable gaming chairs in there that were comfortable enough for all-night gaming sessions. and I figured a few rounds of games would help me blow off some steam. But as soon as my mother-in-law entered the master bedroom, she started complaining again. "Oh my, these sheets are so slippery." As soon as my mother-in-law touched the sheets, she gasped dramatically, running her hand over the smooth fabric. "I can't believe it. My old, rough hands have already snagged the material. Are these the kind of sheets an emperor would sleep on? This is too good for me. Mom, please," James begged, his face etched with exhaustion. "Just sleep here and stop making things difficult for me." It was clear he was even more drained than I was. Watching his parents act out in front of mine must have been soul-crushing for him. If he could have disappeared into thin air, I'm sure he would have. Meanwhile, my father-in-law, having drunk too much, was completely spent. Ignoring my mother-in-law's complaints, he collapsed onto the bed, snoring loudly almost immediately. Taking this as my cue, I quickly left the room. The bedding was brand new, so if they were going to use it, I might as well let it go. My parents had long since quietly retired to their room after washing up, leaving everything in perfect order. James and I finally sat down in front of the computer, trying to process the chaos of the day. "I'll admit it," I said with a sigh. "It was a terrible idea to have everyone spend the new year together." James gave me a tired smile. "No, this is on me. I should never have suggested it. From now on, we'll celebrate separately." I thought to myself, do you think I'd even dare to try this again? "Tomorrow," I continued, "we'll take my parents home after breakfast. Your parents can stay a few more days since they brought all that food. There's probably nothing left for them to eat if they go back right now." Despite his exhaustion, James still managed to be considerate. I found myself recalling how my parents had initially objected to our marriage. James and I had been co-workers, spending plenty of time together at the office. He had joined the company through a competitive process, and his abilities were impressive. He was also attentive and kind to me. While I wouldn't describe myself as beautiful, I had a certain grace that set me apart. By comparison, James was strikingly handsome, standing at 6 feet 1 inch with a strong build. And I'll admit, I'm someone who notices appearances. When I introduced him to my parents, they had a long conversation with him before pulling me aside. "He's a good kid," my dad said, "but I'm a little worried about his family background." "You're marrying him, not his family," I replied confidently. "I know what I'm doing." My family had always been democratic. Seeing my determination, and with James making a great impression, my parents eventually gave in and helped arrange the wedding. James then did something unexpected. He handed my parents a sum of money, asking them to take full charge of the wedding planning. "You have great taste," he told them. "I know you'll organize the kind of wedding Elena would love." He had only one condition. They had to pretend the money came from them and not mention his involvement. I didn't know the details of how they came to this agreement, but the wedding turned out exactly as I'd hoped. James's parents attended as if they were merely guests, not causing any trouble. At the time, I thought it was a sign that everything would be smooth sailing. Looking back now, I realized that the money James used had been his personal savings. He must have told his parents my family was footing the bill and asked them to keep a low profile. His parents, likely seeing an opportunity to save money, played along. This had given me a false impression of them and caused me to miss my chance to see their true colors. Lost in thought, I couldn't even enjoy the game we were playing. James, completely wiped out, reclined his chair and fell asleep almost instantly. I decided to grab a drink from the kitchen. As I opened the door and stepped out, my foot landed on something soft. The unexpected sensation shocked me to the core, and I let out a scream, nearly fainting. The commotion woke everyone. Even my drunken father-in-law staggered out to see what was happening. James was the quickest to react, rushing to my side and wrapping his arms around me protectively. When I finally looked down, I saw my mother-in-law lying on the floor. My head buzzed, and my first thought was that my mother-in-law had fallen ill or hurt herself. But before I could react, she scrambled up from the floor with a scowl. "You weren't looking where you were going," she snapped. She didn't look sick at all. James glanced at her and asked, "Mom, what are you doing here?" It was then I noticed the pillow and blanket on the floor. "That bed's too fancy. We're not used to it. I'll just sleep on the floor to avoid dirtying the sheets," my mother-in-law said pitifully. I felt a wave of frustration rise in my chest, choking me. My mom, usually calm and composed, seemed to reach her limit too. She glanced at my father-in-law, who was still sound asleep on the bed, and said, "The sheets are for 2 people. If the other half is already being used, why not use the rest?" My mother-in-law turned her back, speechless for a moment, before quickly coming up with a retort. "Well, he doesn't know any better. I can't just act as thoughtlessly as he does." Her words were clearly a jab not just at my father-in-law but at my parents as well. "Mother-in-law," my dad finally spoke, his tone calm but authoritative. "It's the holiday season. Keeping things harmonious for the sake of the kids is the least we can do. That's what it means to be thoughtful." Though my dad rarely spoke, his quiet strength always carried weight. Hearing this, my mother-in-law hesitated before picking up her pillow and blanket and retreating back into the master bedroom. James, visibly mortified, quickly followed her, shutting the door behind him. I could hear faint murmurs through the closed door but couldn't make out the conversation. My mom took my hand and pulled me into the living room. The weight of guilt was heavy in my chest. I had invited my parents here to keep them from feeling lonely during the holiday. But instead, I had made things worse. "I don't know what to say about your mother-in-law," my mom said with a sigh as we sat down. "But for James's sake, don't dwell on it. No one chooses the family they're born into." My dad interjected, "There's no need to overthink it. You won't be living together anyway. Just limit contact in the future. If you have the means, be filial by helping them live comfortably. That way, they won't feel the need to interfere." My dad's pragmatism had always been a steadying force for my mom, but even his simple advice felt naive. After today, I realized things wouldn't be so straightforward. The dynamics between my mother-in-law and me were bound to become a recurring problem, and I wasn't sure James would always side with me. He came from that household. After all, for the first time, I deeply regretted not listening to my parents when they expressed their concerns about this marriage. But now, there was no going back. I had to take things one step at a time. Despite the creeping thoughts of divorce, I couldn't bring it up during the New Year festivities. It would only worry my parents unnecessarily. I reassured them with a few light-hearted words before returning to the study. James lay on the recliner facing the door, his face expressionless. It was unclear if he was asleep or just avoiding conversation, not wanting to engage. I left him alone. The festive spirit of New Year's Eve had been completely ruined by my mother-in-law. The next morning, I woke to the sound of firecrackers in the distance. Someone had draped a thick blanket over me during the night. James was nowhere to be seen. From the kitchen, I could hear the cheerful sounds of conversation and the clinking of pots. My parents had woken early to make 100 dumplings. The water was already boiling, ready for me to join them. James was there, helping out and laughing with them. The tension from the night before seemingly lifted. But my in-laws were nowhere to be seen. Curious, I asked James, "Where are your parents? I haven't seen them all morning." The smile on his face faded instantly. "Let's light the firecrackers first," my dad suggested quickly, diverting the conversation. By now, we all understood each other without needing to say much. If my in-laws weren't willing to cooperate, we'd just carry on without them. I realized we didn't need to keep catering to my in-laws endlessly. It had to be mutual. Some people, when treated kindly, take it as fear. Our tradition was to set off firecrackers before eating dumplings. James and I brought a roll of 10,000 firecrackers downstairs. To our surprise, my in-laws were already at the small plaza nearby. When my mother-in-law saw us coming, she rushed over. "How many are in this roll?" she asked, her eyes wide in disbelief. 10,000, I replied when James didn't. "Oh my, that's such a waste to light them all at once. Why don't we take them apart and make 10 rolls of 1,000 each? I know how to do it." With that, she reached out to tear the roll apart. James snatched it back immediately. "What are you doing? Firecrackers are meant to bring good luck. You don't dismantle them to save money. That's what you wanted. I could have just bought smaller rolls." He pushed her aside and spread the firecrackers on the ground. My mother-in-law grumbled but wouldn't move away, so I gently guided her to a safe distance while James lit the fuse. "You really don't know how to manage money. You've completely ruined my son," she suddenly snapped at me. her face contorted with anger. I was caught off guard by her sudden hostility and froze. Before I could respond, the firecrackers erupted in deafening blasts, drowning out everything else. I stood there with my hands over my ears, trying to process what had just happened. That moment, my decision to file for divorce solidified in my mind. More people began to gather at the plaza to set off their firecrackers. On the other side of the square, another family was lighting a roll of 10,000 firecrackers. However, halfway through, the firecrackers sputtered out. "Oh no!" My mother-in-law cackled loudly. Their firecrackers fizzled out. "What bad luck for the year." "Ha ha ha." "Mom, stop it," James hissed, his face pale. He had just recognized the head of that family. It was our company's CEO. Panic-stricken, James hurried over to apologize profusely, bowing and nodding while his mother continued to make sarcastic comments. The CEO and his family glared at us in disgust before turning to leave. But my mother-in-law's attention had already shifted. Her eyes lit up as she noticed the half-used roll of firecrackers left behind. Nudging my father-in-law, she motioned for him to go pick it up. "You're not going," James barked, his voice firm. "It could explode. Get back upstairs." Reluctantly, my in-laws followed us toward the apartment building. The morning chill made us walk briskly, and James even teased me by pretending to grab me, making me laugh as I ran ahead. Then, suddenly, a deafening explosion rang out behind us, followed by screams. We turned around in horror to see my father-in-law sprawled in the snow, blood covering his face and hands. The remnants of a small but powerful firecracker lay nearby. It turned out he hadn't listened and had gone back to pick up the used roll, only for a few connected firecrackers to detonate in his hands. His injuries were severe. With his hands mangled and his face badly cut, we rushed him to the hospital. While he was in surgery, my mother-in-law collapsed onto the floor of the hallway, wailing, "My poor husband." He worked his whole life for his son and never had a single day of comfort. James's face turned dark, his jaw clenched tightly. The nurse couldn't stand her loud sobbing and scolded her sharply. "Keep it down. This is a hospital." My mother-in-law fell silent, but the damage was already done. "Stop disrupting the surgery. If you keep causing a scene, I'll call security." The nurse's voice was sharp and firm. "My husband is in there, and I don't even know if he'll survive." "Why can't I cry?" my mother-in-law wailed, tears and snot streaming down her face. "You're disturbing public order. There are other patients besides your husband. If you don't stop, I'll really call someone to handle this." The nurse turned to James and me. "Aren't you his children? Can't you say something? Control her." I smiled bitterly. "Do you think I haven't tried?" That moment, James stormed over, grabbed his mother's arm, and dragged her toward the door. She struggled but didn't have the strength to break free, shouting protests all the way until he forcibly pulled her out of the ward. After 3 long hours in surgery, my father-in-law was finally wheeled into a recovery room. His right hand had been severely damaged, with multiple fingers detached. In the end, they had to amputate at the wrist. As soon as my mother-in-law saw him, she began wailing again. James silenced her with several stern warnings, reducing her to quiet sobs as she sat begrudgingly in a chair by the bed, refusing to help with anything. James ran himself ragged, buying supplies, fetching hot water, monitoring 4 drips, and helping change bandages. My mother-in-law sat there like a statue, doing absolutely nothing. After dropping my parents off at home, I packed a meal and brought it to the hospital. James looked utterly drained, like a man who'd lost his spirit. His shoulders were hunched, his energy completely spent. "James, you've worked hard all day. Let me stay and help tonight," I offered. Before James could respond, my mother-in-law interjected. "You're just going to leave? Your father-in-law just had surgery, and you're planning to relax at home? What kind of daughter-in-law are you?" I knew exactly what she was trying to do, push all the responsibility onto me while she sat back and gave orders. "I have a project due tonight. I'll head back," I said flatly, ignoring her entirely. I gave James a nod and turned to leave. Panicked, my mother-in-law lunged forward and grabbed me, pulling me off balance. The floor was slippery, and I fell hard to the ground. "Elena, are you okay?" James shouted, rushing over to lift me up and shove his mother aside. My son is beating his own mother for his wife. I can't live like this anymore, she shrieked dramatically, throwing herself to the floor and pounding her legs. Seeing James cradling me was clearly too much for her to handle. The on-duty nurse stormed in. If you can't follow the rules, I'll have you transferred to another hospital. Fine. Let's discharge him. We won't treat him here. James snapped, standing up with a cold expression. His mother froze, realizing he wasn't joking. She reluctantly returned to the chair, muttering under her breath. From that day forward, I stopped visiting the hospital entirely. I arranged for James to take leave from work and handle the caregiving himself. The aftermath of the incident was surprisingly smooth. The group responsible for the defective firecrackers belonged to the CEO of our company, with personnel changes looming. He wanted to avoid any trouble and handled the compensation swiftly. He likely feared jeopardizing his own position. Meanwhile, James remained at the hospital, managing everything alone. His mother, though outwardly subdued, was still a constant source of frustration. I, on the other hand, had made up my mind. I wouldn't allow myself to be dragged down by this family any longer. I heard that after my father-in-law was injured by the defective firecrackers, the company immediately took responsibility. The CEO personally visited to offer their apologies, covering all medical expenses and providing an additional compensation of 200,000 yuan. While the money was helpful, accepting it came with a sense of unease. We all knew what it implied. James tried to decline but eventually had no choice but to accept it. Thankfully, my mother-in-law wasn't present during those discussions, avoiding further complications. So far, everything had been handled relatively well. The incident quickly spread throughout the company, turning into a hot topic of gossip. I tried to keep a low profile, pretending I knew nothing. That's the downside of working in the same company as your spouse. There's no way to avoid being affected. Despite my efforts, trouble found its way to us anyway. That day, I had just stepped out of a meeting when a colleague hurriedly grabbed my arm. You need to check this out. There's an older woman causing a scene in Mr. Feng's office. She looks a lot like your mother-in-law. The way my colleague stammered and avoided eye contact confirmed my worst fear. Without needing further explanation, I rushed to the elevator and headed to the top floor. A crowd had gathered outside Mr. Feng's office, craning their necks to see what was happening. Inside, my mother-in-law's wailing and shouting rang out loud and clear. Pushing through the crowd, I entered the office to find her clutching Mr. Feng's shirt, refusing to let go. A few female colleagues were trying unsuccessfully to pull her off. You heartless man. My husband lost a hand, and all you're offering is 200,000 yuan? I demand 2 million. Not a penny less. Or I'll make sure you regret it. Her words made my vision blur momentarily. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did she even realize what she was doing? This wasn't just her pride at stake. She was dragging James's future into the flames. Summoning all my strength, I pushed past everyone and stormed toward her. She froze for a moment when she saw me, clearly not expecting my arrival. Before she could react, I swung my hand, landing a sharp slap across her face. She staggered back, stunned. Taking advantage of her disorientation, I delivered another slap, followed by a swift kick that sent her sprawling to the floor. Enough. Stop it. Mr. Feng half-heartedly tried to intervene, but he made no real effort to get involved. Seeing her lying on the ground, too dazed to fight back, I grabbed her by the arm and dragged her out of the office into the stairwell, shoving her against the wall. I let my anger boil over. You've lost your mind, haven't you? Barging into the office like this? Do you even realize the damage you've caused? Recovering her composure slightly, she glared at me with wild eyes and tried to lunge forward. How dare you hit your mother-in-law? I'll fight you to the death. I raised my leg and delivered a firm kick to her chest, sending her staggering back. I might have looked frail, but I wasn't. Years of Muay Thai classes had prepared me for moments like this. What's wrong with wanting money for your sake? She cried, clutching her chest and breaking into dramatic sobs. Your father lost a hand. If we don't demand 2 million, how is that fair? Everything I'm doing is for you. Her self-pity only fueled my rage. I trembled, my knees weak and my whole body shaking. Not from fear, but from sheer frustration. I felt utterly helpless as I stood there, unable to remove my mother-in-law from the company and unwilling to ask my colleagues for assistance. Behind the emergency exit door, shadows flickered. People were undoubtedly eavesdropping. Some might even have been recording the scene. My mortification was complete. A job with promising prospects now seemed at risk of slipping through my fingers. I pulled out my phone and called James. "Your mother is causing a scene at the company. I can't get her to leave. Come here immediately." James didn't say a word before abruptly hanging up. "Why are you calling, James? You're always trying to drive a wedge between us." My mother-in-law's finger jabbed toward me as she launched into a tirade. "My son used to be so filial. But look at him now. He's nothing like before. All thanks to you." Her accusations grew louder and filthier by the second. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, James arrived. The moment she saw him, she deflated like a punctured balloon. Lowering her head, she meekly followed us out of the building. James didn't drive us home. Instead, he took us to the riverside. The spring wind was biting cold, and the area was deserted. For the first time in days, I noticed how haggard he looked, like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His hair was unkempt, and a stubble shadowed his face. He must have endured untold stress at the hospital, constantly worn down by his mother's antics. "Elena, I failed you," he said, taking off his wedding ring and placing it in my palm. "I couldn't keep my promises. I couldn't give you happiness. Let's get a divorce." Tears spilled down my cheeks. Despite everything that had happened, I still had feelings for him. His sudden decisiveness shattered me. "I'm sorry. I thought I could escape, but I was selfish. When I came into your life, I realized how different it was from mine. Your mother is gentle and kind. Every conversation with her feels like a breeze in spring. Your father is wise and knowledgeable. I've learned so much from him. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could become part of your family." James sank to his knees, unable to finish his sentence. "You ungrateful bastard." My mother-in-law suddenly snapped, her clarity returning as she found James's weak spot. "I worked so hard to send you to school, and this is how you repay me? By looking down on us?" "Yes, you sent me to school," James retorted, stepping closer to her with every word. "But from the moment I was born, I was bound by you. If I wasn't filial, I'd be condemned by everyone. You were so afraid I'd leave that you changed my college applications. When you thought I wouldn't take care of you in your old age, you used threats of death to force me to stay." James's voice cracked as he continued. "I thought giving you more money, improving your life, would make things better for everyone. But you won't stop until you destroy me, will you?" His mother tried to deflect the blame. "It's her fault. That which poisoned your mind and ruined our relationship. You were so filial before she came along." "Mom, it's not your fault," she added, her tone suddenly conciliatory. "You're still the best. Let's go home and leave her. Divorce her, and everything will be fine." But James's gaze froze her in place. Backing away, she found herself cornered by the railing with the river's rushing current below. She panicked as James took another step closer. "You wanted to trap me, didn't you?" he said quietly. "Well, here's your chance. I'll give you what you want. Elena, be happy." With that, James vaulted over the railing and plunged into the river. My mother-in-law and I screamed as we rushed to the railing. She wailed loudly, "My son, come back. I can't take this anymore." There wasn't a soul in sight. I knew that James wasn't a strong swimmer, and as I watched him sink deeper, panic seized me. I threw off my coat and jumped into the icy river. The cold water was bone-chilling. I swam desperately toward James. He saw me and tried to shout something, but he quickly sank again. My mother-in-law's cries echoed from the riverbank, but I couldn't focus on her. I had no experience rescuing anyone. Once in the water, I realized the danger far exceeded my abilities. The cold sapped my strength, and soon my arms and legs became numb and painfully stiff. I inhaled a mouthful of water and began to panic, sinking further. Though I had learned to swim, it was only in the safety of a pool. Faced with the wild, freezing river, I was completely out of my depth. That moment, I felt a strong arm grab me and lift me above the water's surface. "Get out of here. I'm not worth it." James used all his strength to push me toward the shore. He barely managed to stay afloat himself. Thankfully, a passing sanitation worker saw us and came down to help. As for my mother-in-law, who claimed her entire life revolved around her son, she remained behind the railing, screaming until her voice was hoarse, but she never once attempted to help. James and I were admitted to the same hospital room. My parents rushed over as soon as they heard the news and cared for both of us attentively. They didn't ask many questions. They had always been respectful of boundaries. My mother-in-law, unsurprisingly, never showed up. She was likely at the hospital caring for my father-in-law. That night, James called my name. "Elena, if it weren't for you today, I probably would have really ended my life." "You're foolish. It's not worth it," I said softly. "You're right. It's not worth it," he replied. To be honest, I was hoping someone else would come save me. I wanted to prove that they truly loved me. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "My mom," he said. "Growing up, she was the best swimmer in the area. Famous, even. She used to swim in icy waters regularly. Thought maybe, just maybe, she'd come for me." I understood then. This incident had broken something inside James. He was done. I sighed and gently held his hand. "No matter how bad things get, you shouldn't resort to extremes like that." James buried his face in my hand. His voice choked with sobs. "You don't understand what she's done. Back when I applied to college, she threatened to drink pesticide every day to stop me from leaving. After I started working, every visit home turned into her threatening to end her life if I didn't move back. She'll never let me go." A chill ran down my spine. It was clear my mother-in-law wasn't going to give up control easily. We stayed in the hospital for a few days. Meanwhile, the corporate reshuffle at the company had wrapped up. Mr. Fong, our boss, had stepped down and retired quietly. There were whispers it had something to do with my mother-in-law's earlier outburst. After James's near-death experience, our relationship deepened. He was overwhelmed with gratitude that I had jumped in to save him and vowed to repay me for the rest of his life. For my part, I reevaluated our relationship. Despite the chaos of his family, James himself was a good man. When it mattered most, he had shown he was willing to sacrifice for me. I couldn't bring myself to leave him. The thought of divorce no longer crossed my mind. I thought that after everything that had happened, my mother-in-law would at least quiet down for a few days. But to my surprise, the day we were discharged from the hospital, she came over as if nothing had happened, slipping right back into her old ways. "I made some porridge for you too. You should drink it. I cooked it for 3 hours," she said, placing a lunchbox on the small bedside cabinet. The lunchbox, clearly unused for ages, was stained with greasy residue. James immediately shut her down. "We're not drinking it. We already ate this morning. And we're going home. Go back and take care of Dad." She seized the opportunity to bring up her demands. "You should hire a caregiver for your dad. I'm getting old, and I can't manage anymore. My back hurts, and my legs ache after all these years." "Fine," I replied on James's behalf. "I'll stay at your place. It's too far for your dad to travel back to the village after being discharged. Living in the city is more convenient for hospital visits." But she wasn't satisfied and pushed further. "No, that won't do. You're just trying to drive me out." James's tone was firm. "This isn't up for discussion. Stop making trouble." Her eyes flared, ready for another tantrum, but she swallowed it back. On the ride home, James held my hand tightly. "I need to be honest with you," he said. "Before, I thought I could just go along with it, even make you comply with their demands. I only wanted a peaceful life. But now, I understand. I can't live like that anymore. And I can't drag you into this mess." I nodded. "I trust you, Elena," he continued. "I'll cut ties with them properly. I'll give them money for their retirement. But there will be no more visits or interference. I won't let them make you suffer again." I believed him. When he used every last ounce of his strength to push me out of the water that day, I knew he was a man I could rely on. James wasn't completely ruthless toward his parents, and while that was a flaw, it was also a virtue. If he had been the kind of man to abandon them entirely, I wouldn't have trusted him with my future either. Instead of going straight home, we followed my parents' suggestion to stay at their place for a while to recuperate. James's eyes lit up at the idea, and I agreed. During that time, I watched as James visibly regained his energy and vitality. He shadowed my mom in the kitchen, learning how to cook, arranging dishes, and even helping her edit photos for her social media. He played chess and practiced Tai Chi with my dad, carrying a sword like a loyal sidekick. As my mom joked, he doesn't feel like a son-in-law. He's more like another son. The four of us were happy together, laughing every day. James even took my dad fishing and managed to convince him to quit smoking. For the first time in years, my dad's high blood pressure stabilized. I felt reassured that my choice had been the right one. My mother-in-law didn't know where my parents lived, so she couldn't find us. It wasn't until she caused a scene at my former office that she learned we had both left and taken new jobs. None of my colleagues knew where we had gone. Enraged, she bombarded James with calls, but he blocked her number. Of course, the hospital bills were still settled. We couldn't just leave her husband without care. Just when we thought we were finally in the clear, she stirred up another mess. Having realized she couldn't get anything out of us, she turned her attention to Mr. Fong, retired and restless. He had taken to wandering the neighborhood frequently. My mother-in-law managed to track us down and found where we were staying. From that day on, she started causing trouble at our doorstep every single day. Initially, the Fong family, still harboring some sense of decorum, tried to handle things diplomatically, but as the tension escalated and the root of their frustrations, the cause of all the chaos, presented itself right at their door, they snapped. They physically confronted her. Having grown accustomed to being domineering in her village, my mother-in-law had never faced such a blow to her pride. She retaliated by lying in front of the Fong family daughter-in-law's car, blocking the driveway. Panicked, the daughter-in-law mistakenly hit the gas instead of the brakes, pinning my mother-in-law against the garage door. When James and I got the call and rushed to the hospital, she was barely clinging to life. The doctor informed us there was little point in trying to save her. Her internal organs were beyond repair. "My whole life was for you," she gasped, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. "You have to save me. I've never lived for myself." "It's too late," James responded. His voice choked and his eyes red. "This is what you brought upon yourself." With a look of bitter unwillingness, she closed her eyes, her expression frozen in resentment. The Fong family, wanting to avoid further complications, offered a settlement. James refused to accept the money and instead handed it over to his father. To our surprise, his father immediately went to the provincial capital with the funds and found a woman to take care of him. In the end, my mother-in-law was left with nothing. All her scheming had been for naught, and she died without peace, her plans and pride shattered.